Mutations can happen to any cell at any time. Spontaneous mutations happen just sort of randomly out of nowhere and are usually a result of replication errors when the DNA is trying to make more DNA to make more cells. On contrast, the induced mutations are things that happen because of things in the environment, like exposure to chemicals, UV rays, X-rays, like the sun, is a UV ray. And these things can alter your genetic code, which then can change how the DNA behaves and cause it to behave inappropriately. So what are the effects of mutations? Well, the first one is nothing. Part of the thing here is that those amino acids that we talked about that are coded for by those codons, a lot of them are coded for with several different sequences. So for instance, leucine is coded for with 6 different codons. So if there is an error that causes a change of like CT starts leucine, so CTA, G, C, or T will still be leucine. So those types of errors would just cause the same thing to come about, and that's the case with all of the amino acids. The second thing that can happen when there is a mutation is that a small, completely non-survival affecting trait can come about. For example, once upon a time, there were no humans with blue eyes, and then somebody had a mutation that happened on their DNA that caused their eyes to have a little bit less melanin, and they had blue eyes. And it wasn't a big deal, and nobody really cared, and they couldn't survive really better or worse than anybody else. And so now it's just a different genetic code that we can pass on and inherit from our parents, pass on to our children. Blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, doesn't really matter. The third thing that can happen from mutations, oddly not the thing people usually think about, is a survival advantage. For example, bears have a certain length of claws, but if there is a mutation that allowed the bear's claws to go a little bit longer than normal, then that might allow them to survive better than their peers. Typically, though, when we think about mutations, we think of survival disadvantages. So, for example, human blood is coated with long proteins, and one of the proteins is built and one of the codons on that protein is built with glutamic acid. So this helps to build nice round blood cells that carry lots of great oxygen throughout the body. But if that T gets switched to an A, which literally is just like a reversal of the pair, right? All of a sudden, CAC means valine. And so now the person has sickle cell red blood cells, and they have a disease called sickle cell anemia, which makes it kind of hard for them to do physical activity and causes a lot of cramping and pain. But they're sort of immune to malaria. Different thing for a different day. The fifth thing that can happen is a survival disadvantage, which is cancer. So cancerous cells aren't kind of their own special thing, as we've talked about in another video. It's just when a section of that DNA that controls the replication of the cell that cells are supposed to copy and divide and then rest, and copy, divide, and rest. The cells don't rest in between copying. So they divide out of control, which then causes tumors and sucks the life away from the other cells around it. Whether a child inherits a mutation from their parents depends entirely on when the mutation occurs and its location. Typically speaking, the only time a child is going to inherit a mutation from their parent is that the mutation occurs in or is present in germline cells. And germline cells are cells which will make the reproductive cells or are the reproductive cells themselves. So the sperm and the eggs have to contain the mutation in order for the child to be affected by that mutation. The child then is unaffected by mutations that happen to parents in other parts of their body after they're born, mutations that happen to the parent after the child is born, right? So non-reproductive cell types of mutations or reproductive cell mutations that happens after the child is born have no impact on the child. The last point I want to leave you with is that mutations are not all bad. Mutations give us all of the really cool variation of traits that makes the world like an interesting place. It gives us cats that have stripes and spots and giant manes. It gives us humans that have brown eyes and blue eyes and green eyes and curly hair and straight hair, and all of the great variation of the different trees that have all the cool different leaves. Those were all caused by mutations that happened generations ago that have been passed down and inherited to just become things that we think of as normal traits. Now, that variation then also means that because there's so much variety in the traits of any given set of organisms, those differences are going to result in some trait having a survival advantage over others in almost every scenario, So you're all going to have things that are going to be able to survive better in more situations.